I can't stand crowds. You know, that was one of the worst things about being a follower of Jesus back in the day. The crowds. Everywhere we went, people gathered around to hear what he had to say, begging them for healing and wanting him to settle disputes. I always felt so claustrophobic, you know, so dizzy. Everyone crowding in. I couldn't always hear what was going on because the crowds were so noisy. But if it wasn't for the fact that the crowds were surrounding him, I might have been afraid I'd get lost or left behind. I guess that's one good thing about the crowds, you know. We always knew where Jesus was, right smack bang in the middle. I remember one day though, the crowds, they were just so thick. They were particularly bad. We just got back from this trip across the Sea of Galilee, and as soon as we got off the boat, the crowds, they just gathered. And it wasn't long before this guy, Jairus, he pushed his way through the crowd until he found himself face to face with Jesus. And then the second he got there, he threw himself on the ground before Jesus' feet. Well, what made it even more bizarre was that this guy, he was one of the synagogue presidents. I mean, imagine a man of that stature throwing himself at Jesus' feet in front of such a large crowd of witnesses. Well, naturally, we, along with the rest of the crowd, were dying to know what was going on. So a sudden silence fell over the crowd. "My daughter is going to die. My daughter is going to die," he cried. "Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." No sooner were the words out of his mouth than Jesus reached down with his big, strong hand, caught Jairus by the arm and helped him to his feet. Then, with everyone sitting on the edges of their seats, he spoke 3 words. "Okay, let's go." That was it. That was all he said. Well, I tell you, I've never, ever in my whole life seen a man look so relieved as Jairus did that day. I don't know what he was expecting, but it almost seemed like the one thing that he didn't expect was for Jesus to just go with him without any real explanation or payment or anything. From that point on, he did not shut up. He just kept talking about his little girl as they hurried along. Of course, the crowd went too. In fact, I think the crowd actually grew larger. And I felt like it was crushing in so much that I couldn't even move my arms. Suddenly, amongst all the commotion, Jesus spun around, looking at everyone in the crowd, like eyeballing people. And I thought he was going to tell them all to clear off. But instead he said the strangest thing. Who touched my clothes? Again, the crowd went silent, but this time there seemed to be a sense of confusion. With the number of people gathered around, the question should have been, who didn't touch my clothes? Still, he continued to look around, trying to work out who it was that had touched him. I could see Jairus getting more and more agitated as he waited, and anxious as he waited for Jesus, because Jesus just seemed to be wasting time. So in the end, I spoke up. "Seriously, Jesus, you see all these people, this crowd crushing in on you, and you asked who touched me?" He looked me straight in the eye. You know that look when you just know you've said the wrong thing? This was definitely one of those times, and I'd seen that look so many times from Jesus. He said, "No, someone did touch me. I know it. I felt the power go out from me." And then he just kept looking around and waiting for someone to respond. Suddenly, a woman stepped forward. She looked absolutely petrified, shaking terribly, and then just as Jairus had done, she fell at Jesus' feet. But she didn't ask for anything. She simply started explaining who she was and what was wrong with her. It seems she'd been bleeding, internal bleeding, for 12 years. Can you imagine that? 12 years. She'd had a rough time at the hands of one doctor to the next. She'd spent all her money on treatment and she'd only gotten worse instead of better. My heart was aching for this poor woman. And then she looked at him with tears in her eyes and said, I knew I knew that if I could just touch your clothes, just the edge of your cloak, I'd be made well. And the second I did, I was healed. I realized they were tears of joy as Jesus looked down with love in his eyes and said, "My daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed from your disease." The people in the crowd, they couldn't believe what had just happened right in front of their very eyes. But then I saw Jairus, and the look of relief on his face, it had gone. Yes, there was a sense of awe, but mainly it was a look of anxiety and panic. And that was when the real commotion happened. A couple of guys came pushing through the crowd to get to Jairus. Once they reached him, they told him to stop bothering Jesus. It was too late. His daughter had died. Of course, Jesus heard what they were saying, so he just put his hands on Jairus' shoulders and he said to him, "Do not fear, only believe." Something changed in Jairus at that point. And you could tell that he did exactly as Jesus had told him to. He believed. When we got to the house, the place was in chaos. Everyone was in an awful state. Aunties, uncles, cousins, and neighbours, they were all there weeping and howling. Jesus walks in and he says, "What's all the fuss about?" And he said, "This child isn't dead, she's asleep." Well, the mood in the house changed. People who were crying started laughing at him, mocking him. I was glad when he sent them all out. No one was allowed in the little girl's room except for Jesus, her parents, and the two of us and James. And as soon as we walked into the room, I saw all hope vanish from Jairus' eyes. We were too late. The little girl had died. But Jesus, he just bent over and he took her by the hand and he said, "Time to get up, little girl," just as a mother would to a sleepy child. And you know what? Straight away, she got up and started walking around. Her parents were absolutely astonished. He told them to get her some food and stressed that no one should know what had happened. There were certainly days when being surrounded by crowds was worth it, and this was definitely one of them. I still think about it, There are so many differences between these two healings, so many contrasts. Rich, poor, powerful, powerless. Asks for healing, takes the healing without asking. 12-year-old girl with an acute and sudden illness, and a 12-year-old chronic illness in a grown woman. A girl who is touched by Jesus and raised from the dead, and a woman who touches Jesus, who is healed while still being very much alive. On one hand, these two stories are so different, but on the other hand, at their very core, they're the same story. They're stories of two people who, when they came into contact with Jesus, were transformed from death to life. Oh, sure, the woman was alive when she was healed, but can you imagine what life would have been like for her? She would have been an outcast, unclean. She wouldn't have been allowed to participate freely in society. How is that being alive? The day these two very different people came into contact with Jesus was the day of their salvation. Their lives were transformed. But just think about what that means for the rest of us. We know scholars. We used to be just fishermen. But the day we came into contact with Jesus was the day our lives changed forever. It doesn't matter what we do for a living or who we are or what our social stature is. We're all pretty much left for dead, all dying. Until we encounter Jesus. Until we are either touched by Jesus or we reach out and touch him ourselves. And then and only then are we delivered from death and given the sacred gift of life. before I leave, I just want to ask you, what will you do? Will you push through the crowd to get to Jesus? Will you push your way through to ask for healing, for freedom? Will you come as you are, bringing everything that you have and leaving it at Jesus' feet? Come to him today. Come just as you are.